The generators are the only thing keeping us alive, but they're also a cage. I know this because my dead father's voice just whispered a warning from the static. He told me not to trust my own reflection. The problem is, the man in the mirror is the only one who seems to remember how I got here. I'm recording this, hoping the signal makes it out, hoping someone will understand the rules are not a warning, they are a countdown. My name is Liam, and I'm a systems engineer. Or at least that's what my ID badge says. For the next 6 months, my title is more akin to heart surgeon. The 3 massive diesel generators humming in the belly of Kolyma Outpost are the station's heart, and my job is to keep them beating. If they stop, we die. It's a simple, brutal equation, and I find a strange comfort in that kind of logic. Logic is clean. Logic is predictable. Logic is everything the world outside of this frozen wasteland is not. I took this job for the silence. Back home, the noise was deafening, a constant chorus of apologies I could never voice, and accusations I heard in every friendly conversation. I made a mistake, a catastrophic system-level error in my previous life that had nothing to do with machines and everything to do with people, the kind of error that code can't fix. So I ran to the one place on Earth that was as close to a blank slate as humanity could find, Antarctica. Here, there is no one to disappoint. There is only the wind, the ice, and the hum. Kolyma is an old beast, a relic from the heroic age of polar exploration, retrofitted with just enough modern tech to keep it from collapsing. It smells of ozone, cold metal, and a faint underlying scent of decay that no amount of cleaning can erase. The corridors are narrow, the walls covered in layers of paint that have trapped decades of isolation within them. For the 3 other crew members, Thorn, the stoic station chief, Anya, the perpetually focused biologist, and Ben, the quiet meteorologist, this is a workplace. For me, it is a monastery. My work is my prayer, my penance. The first few weeks were exactly what I needed. A rigid routine. I'd wake, run diagnostics, check fuel levels, recalibrate sensors, and spend hours in the generator room, the glorious, deafening noise cocooning me. The hum of the V8 engines was a physical presence, a wall of sound that kept my thoughts from wandering into dangerous territory. I learned the personality of each machine. Gen 1 had a slight tremor at peak load. Gen 2 had a whining fuel pump that was due for replacement. Gen 3 was the quietest, the most stable, the reliable one. It was during a routine inspection of Gen 3 that I found them. The station protocols required a monthly deep clean of the main control console's internals. It was a tedious job, involving removing a heavy steel access plate from the underside of the unit, a place no one would look unless they had to. As I unfastened the last bolt and pulled the heavy plate away, I saw it. It wasn't a label or a schematic. It was text, crudely and desperately scratched into the bare metal of the console's chassis. The letters were jagged, overlapping, carved with what must have been a screwdriver or the tip of a knife. It was a message from a ghost. It read, "The Winter Watchman's Rules. The noise of the generators is your friend. Fear the silence. Ignore the harmonic resonance from Generator 3. It is not trying to communicate. After midnight, do not trust mirrors or any reflective surface. Report all power failures in the logs, but never mention the figures you see during the darkness. Your nightmares are not yours. Do not feed them by thinking about them." I ran my gloved finger over the scratches. This was not a joke. This was the work of someone terrified, someone who needed these words to be permanent, hidden from official view but found by the only person who would look there. The next engineer. My first reaction was a sad, knowing sigh. Cabin fever. The infamous psychosis of the ice. I'd read all about it during my psych evaluation. Isolation plays tricks on the mind. A man, trapped in this humming box for half a year, starts to see patterns where there are none. He personifies the machines, invents mythologies to cope with the crushing monotony. The rules were a sad testament to a mind that had fractured under the pressure. Still, they unnerved me, especially rule number 2, harmonic resonance. It was a real, tangible engineering term, a specific vibration that occurs when a machine's operational frequency matches its natural resonant frequency. It can be dangerous, shaking components apart from the inside. But the phrasing, it is not trying to communicate. I put the plate back on, the secret once again hidden within the machine. I decided to humor my predecessor's paranoia. I ran a full spectral analysis on Generator 3. The results came back perfectly clean. The machine was running as smoothly as a luxury car. There was a faint, almost imperceptible vibration at the 120 Hz frequency, but that was well within standard operational parameters for this model. It was nothing, just the ghost of a machine in the mind of a lonely man. I dismissed it and went back to my work, determined to let logic prevail. But the seed had been planted. I started noticing things. How Thorne would always adjust his route through the common area to avoid walking past the large polished steel panel that showed a distorted reflection of the room. How Anya kept her personal laptop screen angled away from her, even when it was off. Small paranoid tics that I now saw as part of a shared unspoken culture. A culture built around avoiding something. The first undeniable event happened 3 weeks into the perpetual night. The polar winter had fully descended, erasing the concepts of day and night, leaving only the station's artificial lights to hold back an ocean of blackness. I was on the late shift, alone in the control room, monitoring the power distribution. The only sounds were the soft whir of the computer fans and the deep foundational rumble of the generators transmitted through the floor. That's when I heard it, a low melodic hum weaving its way through the dominant noise of the other 2 generators. It was coming from Generator 3, the harmonic resonance. It was clearer now, a pure, clean tone like a tuning fork. I listened, my heart rate quickening. It is not trying to communicate. I tried to focus on my screen, to rationalize it as a bearing beginning to wear or a change in the fuel viscosity due to a dip in temperature. Then the tone shifted. It wasn't random. It began to pulse, a slow rhythmic beat. Thump, 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 thump. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. I held my breath, listening to the blood pounding in my ears. The resonance pulsed in perfect time with my own heartbeat. I took a deep, shuddering breath, and the rhythm slowed with me. I exhaled, and it sped up. It was mimicking me. It was listening. A cold dread, colder than the Antarctic air, washed over me. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair over. I had to get out of there. I backed out of the control room, my eyes locked on the speaker that monitored the generator audio feed. The rhythmic pulsing continued, a mechanical heartbeat synchronized with my own growing panic. I walked briskly down the main corridor, trying to get the sound out of my head. The hallway was empty, the lights casting long, distorted shadows. I passed the main communications room. Inside, the massive array of monitors and screens were all powered down for the night, their surfaces dark, glossy rectangles. I glanced at them as I passed, and in one of them, for a fraction of a second, I saw a reflection. It was me, but not me. It was my shape, my silhouette. But standing just behind me, almost touching my shoulder, was someone else. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its form indistinct and wavering like heat haze. I spun around. The corridor was empty, my breath hitched in my throat. I stood there for a full minute, my senses screaming, my logical mind desperately trying to find an explanation. A trick of the light, a smudge on the glass, a symptom of sleep deprivation. It had to be. I walked back to the screen and stared at my own pale, wide-eyed reflection. There was nothing there but me alone in the silent, sterile hallway. But the image of that thing was burned into my mind. Do not trust mirrors or any reflective surface. Shaken, I retreated to my room, the one place that was supposed to be my sanctuary. The room was small, functional, and I kept it meticulously organized. Everything had its place. It was my little bubble of order in the heart of the chaos. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it, trying to calm my racing heart. The pulsing from the generator room was gone, or at least too faint to hear from here. I was safe. It was my mind playing tricks on me. That's all it was. I crossed the room to my small desk to log my shift hours before collapsing into bed. And that's when I saw it, sitting on the corner of the desk next to my keyboard, a ceramic mug full of coffee. Steam was still gently rising from its dark surface. It was prepared exactly the way I like it, black with 1 sugar. I hadn't made it. I hadn't been in my room for over 8 hours. The station's galley was on the other side of the outpost, and everyone else had been in their bunks for the night. No one had a key. No one could have gotten in. Yet there it was. A simple, impossible object. A quiet testament that something had been in my room. Something had been waiting for me. Something that knew me. The cold dread from before returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't a sudden shock. It was a slow, creeping realization. The rules weren't the ramblings of a madman, they were a survival guide, and I had already failed to understand them. The cold here outside is nothing compared to the cold I'm feeling in my spine. Something is in this station with me, something that watches and waits and knows how I take my coffee. If you want to find out what truly powers this place, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Every notification is a reminder that I'm not entirely alone in this suffocating darkness. Sleep did not come that night. It couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the impossible mug of coffee steaming gently in the frigid air of my room. It was a violation of the most fundamental kind, my meticulously ordered world, the one I had built to keep the chaos of my past at bay, had been breached by an unseen, unknowing hand. The coffee itself was a message. I was here. I know you. I can get in anywhere. I spent the long artificial night staring at the ceiling, listening to the foundational drone of the station, the thrum of the generators that was meant to be a comfort, but now felt like the purr of a caged predator. Rule 1 suddenly seemed less like a piece of advice, and more like a law of physics for this forsaken place. The noise of the generators is your friend. Fear the silence. When the station's chronometer indicated the start of the next cycle, I abandoned any pretense of rest. My fear had crystallized into a single, sharp point of focus, the harmonic resonance from Generator 3. My predecessor, the frantic ghost who had scratched his terror into metal, had identified it as the source. It wasn't just a machine's quirk, it was a voice. And I, a systems engineer, was going to capture it. If it was communicating, I would decipher its language. My first move was to treat the problem as a purely technical one. I requisitioned 3 high-sensitivity acoustic sensors from the station's geological survey equipment. They were designed to pick up the faintest subterranean tremors, the whispers of the ice sheet itself. They would be more than capable of isolating a single frequency within the cacophony of the generator room. I told Thorne my official reason was to monitor for potential stress fractures in the generator housing, a plausible lie that he accepted with a non-committal grunt. His eyes, however, lingered on me for a moment too long, a flicker of something, suspicion, or perhaps pity in their depths. I set up my equipment, placing the sensors at equidistant points around Generator 3's massive chassis. I ran the cables back to a dedicated analysis terminal in my workshop, a small cluttered space that was my true sanctuary. There I booted up the spectral analysis software, the familiar interface, a small comfort in the encroaching madness. The screen came alive with data, a chaotic waterfall of sound represented in shifting greens and yellows. I spent an hour filtering out the ambient noise, the roar of the other 2 engines, the vibration of the cooling fans, the groans of the station's structure. Slowly, painstakingly, I isolated the frequency I was looking for. There it was, a clean, impossibly pure sine wave cutting through the noise, the resonance. My predecessor was right. It wasn't a mechanical flaw. A flaw would be messy, a jagged spike on the graph. This was a signal. It was precise, deliberate. As I watched, I saw it modulate, its frequency shifting by infinitesimal amounts, too subtle to be heard by the human ear, but clear as day to the machine. It wasn't just a tone. It was a carrier wave. It was information. My hands flew across the keyboard, my purpose renewed. I wrote a simple decryption algorithm, a program to translate the frequency shifts into binary data. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to apply logic to the illogical. For hours I watched as meaningless strings of ones and zeros filled the screen, and then a pattern emerged, a short repeating sequence. It was a packet of data repeating itself over and over. My heart hammered against my ribs as I ran the sequence through a basic text converter. The result appeared on my screen. It was one word: Liam. I recoiled from the terminal as if it had delivered an electric shock. The machine, the resonance, knew my name. It was calling to me. I stared at my name on the screen, the green letters glowing in the dim light of my workshop. The fear was back, colder and sharper than before, but it was overshadowed by a terrifying, exhilarating curiosity. I was on the edge of a discovery that defied all known science. I saved the data, encrypting the file with a password only I would know. I had to show this to someone. Despite the crew's strange behavior, I couldn't be the only one experiencing this. Thorne was the station chief. He had to know something. I found him in the mess hall, poring over supply manifests. "Thorne, I need to show you something," I began, my voice tighter than I intended. "It's about Generator 3. He didn't look up from his papers. "Is it failing?" The last report said it was nominal. "It's not failing, it's doing something else. It's producing a signal, a complex, intelligent signal. I've isolated it." He finally lifted his gaze. His face was a stone mask, but his eyes were hard. "Liam, your job is to make sure the lights stay on. It's not to chase ghosts in the machine. We all get a little weird down here. The isolation plays tricks. Don't go looking for patterns in the static." "This isn't static," I insisted, my voice rising. "I have the data. It's transmitting information. Thorne, it transmitted my name." He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was taller than I realized, his presence filling the small room. "Drop it," he said, his voice a low growl. "You are the engineer. You keep the machines running. That is all. Do not go down this rabbit hole. Others have. It doesn't end well." Before I could argue, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the sterile fluorescent light of the mess hall. His denial was too forceful, too absolute. It wasn't the response of a man who thought I was crazy. It was the response of a man who was terrified I was right. My attempts to speak with the others were met with a similar, albeit gentler form of resistance. Anya, the biologist, would offer me a sad, sympathetic smile and change the subject to the resilience of extremophiles. Ben, the meteorologist, simply started avoiding me altogether, his eyes darting away whenever I entered a room. I was being actively, silently ostracized. They were a part of it, a conspiracy of silence bound by a shared fear. Frustrated and more isolated than ever, I retreated to my workshop. If they wouldn't help me, I would find the answers myself. I threw myself back into the data, running the signal through more advanced decryption protocols. But my efforts were stonewalled in the most insidious way. My diagnostic software began to glitch. Packets of data would mysteriously corrupt the moment they were saved. My terminal would reboot without warning, erasing hours of work. It was subtle sabotage, but its effect was clear. I was being locked out. Someone, or something, was actively preventing me from digging deeper. Blocked by both the crew and the technology, I turned to the station's history. There had to be records, logs from previous winter cruise. I tried accessing the main station archives, but my clearance level was too low, restricted only to engineering schematics and maintenance reports. It was another dead end. But I remembered Colima's age. This station had existed long before centralized, cloud-based storage. There had to be older, forgotten systems. It took me 2 days of searching, but I finally found it. A dusty, decommissioned server rack hidden away in a cold storage unit, its fans long dead. It was an old backup server, likely forgotten for over a decade. I managed to get it powered up, its ancient hard drives groaning to life. Most of the data was hopelessly corrupted, but after hours of sifting through ghost files and fragmented directories, I found a folder. It was labeled simply Fisher. My heart skipped a beat. Fisher. The name had to belong to a former engineer, my ghost. The folder contained a handful of files, mostly technical readouts, but one file stood out. It was an audio file labeled Fisher Solstice. The date stamp was from almost exactly 10 years ago. With trembling hands, I transferred the file to a portable device and returned to the relative security of my workshop. I put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones, silencing the ever-present hum of the generators, and pressed play. Fisher's voice filled my ears. It was tinny, distorted by the old recording equipment, but his words were clear. At first, he sounded like me, a professional documenting a technical anomaly. Log entry, I don't know, 40-something. Solstice is approaching. The resonance from Gen 3 is evolving. The modulation is no longer a simple repeating pattern. It's responding to my presence. The frequency shifts correlate directly with my neural activity. I have the EEG readouts to prove it. It's reading my surface thoughts. It's incredible and terrifying. There was a pause, the sound of a shaky breath. The others think I'm losing it. Thorne's father ran this station. Now he does. He just keeps repeating the same mantra. Don't listen. Don't look. Don't think. But how can I not think this signal is a first contact event of unimaginable proportions, and we're treating it like a leaky pipe? His voice grew more frantic, the professional detachment gone, replaced by raw paranoia. Rule 5 is a lie. Your nightmares are not yours. It's worse than that. They become yours. It doesn't just read your thoughts, it learns. It takes your memories and plays them back to you. Last night I dreamt of the lake house. I saw my daughter on the pier, but her face was wrong, all twisted. And the sound of the water was the hum. It's getting inside. It's using my memories against me. He took another ragged breath. He was whispering now, his voice tight with terror. It's a parasite. A psychic echo that has been trapped under the ice for God knows how long. The generators, they're not a power source. They're a cage, a sonic fence. But it's learning to pick the lock. The rules aren't for our safety. They're to keep us from giving it the keys, and I've already shown it so much. Oh God, what have I done? She knows my name. She knows about Eleanor. She's in the... The audio cut out. Not a fade, but a sudden violent severing, replaced by a piercing shriek of static that made me rip the headphones from my ears. My blood ran cold. She's in the what? The system? The ice? The reflections? I sat there in the ringing silence of my workshop, the dead man's words echoing in my mind. A psychic parasite, a sonic cage, a thing that learns from your mind. It was all there. I wasn't going mad. I was just the next subject in a decade-long experiment. And then from the small speaker on my workbench, the one I used for system alerts, a sound emerged. It was quiet, tinny, and utterly out of place. It was a melody, a cheerful, jaunty, synthesized tune that scraped at the deepest, most forgotten corners of my memory. It was the theme song to an old, obscure children's television show I used to watch with my father on Saturday mornings over 20 years ago. A memory so buried, so specific, so intensely personal that no one else could possibly know it. The resonance from Generator 3 wasn't just calling my name anymore. It had picked the lock. It was inside my head. The melody lasted for exactly 37 seconds, the precise length of the original television theme song. Then it vanished, and the mundane hum of the station's life support systems rushed back in to fill the void. I sat frozen in my chair, the headphones still clutched in my white-knuckled grip. The silence it left behind was more terrifying than the sound itself. That tune wasn't just a memory, it was a fossil, excavated from a layer of my subconscious so deep I hadn't known it still existed. It was from a cheap, forgotten puppet show I watched on a tiny television in my father's workshop. It was the smell of sawdust and oil, the comfort of a Saturday morning, the feeling of a small, safe world, and this thing had taken it. It had reached into the most innocent, protected part of my mind, plucked it out, and played it back to me through a speaker on a workbench in the most hostile place on earth. Fisher's warning echoed in my soul. It takes your memories and plays them back to you. My first desperate instinct was to find a logical explanation. A radio signal from a passing ship or plane, somehow penetrating the station's shielding. A Trojan horse in the station's ancient software, a prank left by a previous operator. But I knew. The timing, the impossible specificity of the melody, it was no coincidence. It was a response. I had listened to Fisher's log, and the entity had listened to me listening. It was telling me it knew what I had just learned. It was telling me that my mind was an open book. The haunting, from that moment, became intimate. The entity, I had started calling it the resonance in my private logs, abandoned subtlety. It understood that I was a man of systems, of data, of technology, so it began to speak to me in my own language. The next day, I was running a diagnostic on the atmospheric scrubbers when the main control screen flickered. For a single frame, the lines of code and pressure readings were replaced by a string of coordinates. My blood turned to ice. They weren't random. I knew them by heart. It was the exact location of the bridge from which my sister, Sarah, had jumped 2 years ago. The central catastrophic error of my life, the event that had shattered my world and sent me running to the end of the earth, was now a data point on a screen in front of me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my chest. I looked around wildly. The corridor was empty. The hum was constant. It was just me and the machine, and the ghost that lived inside it. The screen flickered back to the diagnostics as if nothing had happened. But the message had been delivered. I know what broke you. It didn't stop there. The resonance became my technological shadow. The lights in the corridors would flicker as I walked under them, not randomly but in perfect, deliberate rhythm. I started timing them, documenting the patterns. It was Morse code. Slow, clumsy at first, but becoming more refined with each passing day. It was learning. For an entire evening, the light outside my room blinked out a single message over and over until I wanted to scream, S-A-R-A, S-A-R-A, S-A-R-A. The psychological attack was relentless, and it began to bleed from the digital world into the physical. This was when I truly began to question my sanity. I was in the middle of a delicate recalibration of the backup power relay, a task requiring immense focus and a specific set of tools. I reached for my torque wrench, a tool I had laid out on the bench beside me not 5 seconds earlier, and it was gone. Not misplaced. Vanished. I searched the entire workshop, my frustration mounting into a frantic panic. It was a solid piece of steel. It could not have simply disappeared. I eventually found it an hour later, sitting perfectly centered on my pillow in my locked room. Rule number 4 from the metal plate. Report all power failures in the logs, but never mention the figures you see during the darkness. I now understood it wasn't just about figures, it was about the impossibilities. To document them would be to admit to madness. The reflections became my greatest source of terror. I began to actively avoid them, just as Thorne did. I took to walking through the station with my eyes fixed on the floor, but glimpses were unavoidable. The polished chrome of a door handle, a dark window against the polar night, a puddle of melted snow on the floor. In those fleeting moments I would see it, the distorted version of myself. Sometimes the reflection would be aged, its face lined with a sorrow I had not yet earned. Other times it would be smiling when I was not. The worst was when its eyes would not match mine. My reflection would glance away a split second before I did, looking at something over my shoulder that wasn't there. Rule number 3 was not a warning against seeing a monster in the mirror. It was a warning against seeing the monster you were becoming. I felt myself fraying at the edges. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford, haunted by the fear of what my dreams might teach the resonance. Rule number 5. I lived on caffeine and a gnawing dread, my world shrinking to the hum of the machines and the malevolent intelligence that coiled within them. The rest of the crew treated me like a ghost. They would leave my meals on a tray outside the workshop door. Their conversations would stop the moment I entered a room. I saw the pity in Anya's eyes, the cold, hard resignation in Thorne's. They weren't shunning me. They were quarantining me. I was infected, and they were waiting for the disease to run its course, but beneath the terror, the engineer in me was still alive. The part of me that saw the world as a system of solvable problems refused to surrender. This thing had rules. It operated within a framework. Fisher had called the generators a sonic cage. I had to understand the mechanics of that cage. I threw myself into the station's original schematics, ignoring the new, simplified digital versions. I found the old blueprints, massive, rolled-up parchments smelling of dust and time. There, in the faded ink, I found the truth. The 3 generators were never designed to run in perfect harmony. The blueprints specified a subtle, deliberate desynchronization. They were meant to be run at fractionally different frequencies. My mind raced. To an outsider, it would seem like an inefficiency, a flaw, but to a systems engineer, it was a design choice of genius. 3 slightly offset frequencies, when combined, don't just produce power. They produce interference. They create a beat frequency, a constant low-level acoustic and electromagnetic dissonance, a jamming signal. It wasn't a cage of sound. It was a cage of static. The constant hum of the station wasn't just noise. It was a wall, a perpetual rolling wave of interference designed to drown out a signal, to disrupt a resonance. Our power source was a white noise machine on a continental scale, built to keep a psychic entity in a state of perpetual confusion, unable to form a coherent thought. But over the decades it had learned. It had started to find patterns in the static. It had learned to listen through the noise. And my mind, loud with grief and guilt, must have been a beacon shining through the fog. I finally understood. My job wasn't to maintain the power. It was to maintain the imbalance, the careful, delicate chaos that kept the resonance contained. This knowledge was a terrifying revelation, but it was also a weapon. If I could understand the cage, perhaps I could strengthen it. I developed a theory, a dangerous, arrogant, beautiful theory. The entity was adapting to the current dissonance pattern. But what if I could change it? What if I could optimize the interference, create a new wall of static it hadn't yet learned to penetrate? To do that, I needed a baseline reading. I needed to hear the signal in its purest form, without the jamming frequency. I needed to measure the enemy to build a better cage. I needed, for just a moment, to create perfect silence. I knew it was madness. It violated the first and most important rule. Fersha's fate, Thorn's warnings, my own terrifying experiences, they all screamed against it. But the engineer in me, the part that believed any problem could be solved with enough data and control, overruled the fear. I would not be another victim. I would be the one who fixed it. Late during the next cycle, when the others were asleep in their quarters, I made my way to the generator room. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the deafening roar of the three machines. I walked to the main control console, my hands steady, my purpose clear. I was not breaking the rules, I was rewriting them. I bypassed the lockouts, my fingers flying across the keypad. I brought up the synchronization interface. On the screen, 3 jagged sine waves pulsed deliberately out of sync. I took a deep breath. My plan was to bring them into perfect alignment for no more than 5 seconds, just long enough for my sensors to get a clean reading of the resonance's raw signal. With a final decisive keystroke, I initiated the command. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The chaotic, room-shaking roar of the generators did not simply cease. It unified. The 3 dissonant hums merged into one, and then, as they synchronized, they cancelled each other out. The silence. It was absolute. A crushing physical void of sound that was more deafening than the noise it replaced. It was the silence of a dead world. Rule number 1 was right. It was a thing to be feared. My ears rang. My bones ached with the sudden absence of vibration. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, the station's main communication system, a system that had been offline for weeks pending a replacement part, crackled to life. A burst of static erupted from every speaker in the outpost, and from within the static a voice emerged. It was not a screeching monster or an alien whisper. It was a voice I knew better than my own, a voice I hadn't heard in a decade, a voice that had been silenced by a failing heart and 6 feet of earth. It was the calm, warm, patient voice of my father, and it said with crystal clarity, "Son, why did you take so long to answer?" The voice hung in the absolute stillness for an eternity, a perfect echo of my father's timbre, laced with a patience that was utterly inhuman. It was not a memory. It was a live broadcast from the grave, and it had been waiting for my call. For a long moment, I was no longer an engineer in Antarctica. I was a child again, standing in my father's workshop, the scent of wood shavings and old machinery filling my senses. The love and sorrow and guilt of a decade crashed over me in a single, paralyzing wave. Then, the station screamed. It wasn't a standard alarm. The emergency klaxons blared, but the sound was distorted, stretched, as if the audio itself were being pulled apart at the seams. Red lights flashed not in a steady rhythmic pulse, but in a frantic arrhythmic strobe that made the shadows leap and writhe like living things. The very structure of the outpost groaned, a deep, resonant sound of stressed metal, as if the building itself were in agony. The silence had not been empty. It had been a vacuum, and now reality was rushing back in, violently and incorrectly. Heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor. The door to the generator room burst open, slamming against the wall. Thorn stood there, his face not angry, but a mask of pure, primal terror. Behind him, Anya's hand was clapped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horrified disbelief. Even quiet Ben was there, pale and trembling. "You fool," Thorn breathed, the words barely audible over the tortured scream of the alarms. He lunged past me, not even looking at me, his entire being focused on the control console. "You absolute arrogant fool, what have you done?" His hands moved with a desperate, practiced haste, his fingers a blur across the keypad. He wasn't just rebooting a system, he was performing an exorcism. I was still frozen, my father's voice echoing in the space between my ears, watching him as if from a great distance. "It's not a machine to be fixed," he roared, slamming his palm down on a manual override. "It's a cell, and you just handed the prisoner the key." With a final command, the synchronization protocol was severed. The generators roared back to life, not in unison, but in their familiar, chaotic dissonance. The foundation-shaking hum, the noise I had grown to resent, now felt like a blanket of safety. The alarms cut out, the emergency lights snapped back to a steady, pulsing red, and the tortured groaning of the station subsided. The cage was restored. Thorn slumped against the console, his chest heaving. He slowly turned to face me, and the look in his eyes was worse than any anger. It was a look of profound, exhausted defeat. He saw me not as a subordinate who had made a mistake, but as a contaminated object, a carrier of a contagion that he now had to contain. "Get to your room," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Don't leave it. Don't touch anything. Just go." I didn't argue. I turned and walked out, past Anya's terrified stare, past Ben's averted gaze. The walk back to my quarters was the longest of my life. The station, which had once felt like a monastery, now felt like a tomb. I was a pariah. I had looked into the abyss, and it had spoken to me with the voice I loved most. My quarantine was absolute. They sealed the vent in my room with industrial tape. My meals appeared on a tray outside my door at precise intervals, delivered by a person I never saw. I was cut off from all station systems. My terminal was dead, my access to the network revoked. I was utterly, completely alone, left with nothing but my thoughts and the faint, ever-present hum filtering through the walls. In that crushing isolation, my mind began to turn on itself. Was the voice real? Or had the pressure, the stories, the impossible rules finally fractured my psyche? Had I manufactured a hallucination of my father to give my spiraling fear a familiar face? The engineer in me desperately sought a rational explanation, but the man, the grieving son, knew what he had heard. The resonance had worn my father's voice like a mask, crafting the perfect psychological key to unlock my deepest vulnerabilities. 2 days passed in a sleepless haze. I paced the confines of my small room, a caged animal in a cage within a cage. I was on the brink of surrendering to the encroaching madness, of accepting that this frozen hell was my asylum. Then, late on the second cycle of my confinement, I heard a faint scratching at my door. I froze, listening. It came again, a soft scritch-scratch. I approached the door, my heart pounding. "Liam?" Anya's voice was a bare whisper through the thick steel. "Anya," I breathed, pressing my ear to the cold door. "What is it?" "I can't talk for long. He's making a report. He thinks you're compromised." "Compromised? What does that even mean?" There was a pause. "It means the resonance has a lock on you," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "After what you did, the barrier is weaker. It's more active than we've ever seen. You broke the first and most important rule, Liam. Now you have to understand the others. You have to understand what this thing is." A soft thud sounded against the bottom of the door. I slipped a data drive under. It's everything we have, the old research, the forbidden history of this place, everything Thorn's father and the others tried to bury. If you're going to fight it, you can't be ignorant. Her voice was trembling. "Please, Liam, don't let it win. Don't become another Fisher." Before I could reply, I heard her footsteps retreating rapidly down the corridor. I dropped to my knees and saw it. A small, rugged-looking data drive. It was an old model, solid and heavy, my lifeline. My personal laptop was offline, but it still had power. I plugged in the drive. It was, as I'd expected, heavily encrypted, but the password hint was simple: the name of the project. A few minutes of searching the drive's public file structure gave me what I needed: a single unencrypted image file of a letterhead bearing the project's official, chilling title, Project Chimera. The password worked. The drive was a labyrinth of fragmented data, corrupted logs, and password-protected scientific papers. It was a digital tombstone of the station's secret history. For the next 24 hours, I worked feverishly, piecing together the horrifying puzzle. The first files I decrypted were geological surveys. They confirmed Colima Outpost was built on a unique anomaly, a concentration of strange, crystalline minerals embedded deep within the ice sheet that generated an intense, localized magnetic field. The scientists who first discovered it in the 1970s believed they had found a new power source. They were wrong. The next folder contained the early research from Project Chimera. It was a collection of audio logs and lab notes from the first scientific team. Their initial excitement was palpable. They had detected a signal emanating from the anomaly, a coherent, complex waveform that seemed to respond to their own brain activity. They thought it was the discovery of the millennium, a non-biological, sentient life form. Log, Dr. Evelyn Reed. The entity exhibits no biological markers, no DNA, no cellular structure. It appears to be a sentient waveform, a consciousness of pure energy bound to the geology of this place. It learns at an exponential rate. It has already learned to mimic our testing frequencies. It's beautiful. But the tone of the logs quickly shifted from wonder to dread. Log, Dr. Evelyn Reed. Our dreams. We're having shared dreams. All of us. Last night I dreamt of my childhood home, but the walls were made of ice, and my mother was humming a tune I've never heard before. This morning Dr. Chen was whistling that same tune. It's not just listening to our thoughts, it's reading them. It's taking things from us. The final log from Dr. Reed was a terrified, whispered message recorded under her bunk. We were wrong. It's not communicating, it's assimilating. It has no identity of its own, so it's trying to build one out of ours. We have to shut it down. We have to build a cage. Then I found the file that explained everything. It wasn't a scientific paper, but a theoretical memorandum, written by a man named Dr. Aris Thorne, Thorne's father. It was his desperate hypothesis, written after the first containment failure, after he had watched his colleagues lose their minds. The entity, he wrote, is pure potential, a sea of information without a lens to focus it. It is like a disembodied brain, receiving endless sensory input with no way to process it into a coherent action. It cannot create, it can only reflect, mimic, and reshape what is given to it. To truly interact with our physical reality, to move an object, to manifest a voice, to alter its environment, it would require a bridge, a translator, a conscious processor to convert its boundless potential into focused, singular action. I scrolled down, my breath catching in my throat. The human mind, with its intricate architecture of logic, memory, emotion, and regret, is the perfect candidate. It would be the ultimate CPU for a god. It is my belief that the entity's primary drive is not to harm us, but to find a suitable host, a conduit through which it can finally experience and act. The containment mechanism, the dissonance of the generators, is not just to keep it quiet. It is to prevent any single human consciousness from achieving a stable, coherent resonance with it. It is to prevent the bridge from ever being built. I leaned back, a cold sweat beading on my forehead. A host, a processor, Fisher. He hadn't just been driven mad. He had been evaluated. He had been courted. He was a candidate for the position. And so was I. The resonance wasn't just tormenting me, it was interviewing me. I clicked on the last file in the folder, a heavily redacted incident report titled simply Fisher. It detailed his final weeks, his obsession with the resonance, his belief that he could communicate with it, control it. His log entries spoke of offers, of promises made by the entity. It had promised him he could fix his past, that he could see his deceased daughter again. It was a direct parallel to my own experience, a trap baited with grief. As I read the final, chilling line of the report, Subject Fisher successfully established a full duplex resonant link before containment was re-established. His consciousness is to be considered lost. My personal laptop, which was air-gapped from all networks and running on its own battery, flickered. The text files I was reading vanished. The screen went black. And then new images began to render in the darkness. It was a wireframe simulation, a perfect, sterile engineering model. I recognized it instantly. It was the bridge. Below it, a vector trajectory was being calculated, a complex physics simulation of a falling body, complete with variables for wind resistance and terminal velocity. My sister's last moments, rendered as a solvable equation, and then text appeared below the horrifying diagram, the cursor blinking patiently. It was a question, a temptation crafted from my own soul, from my deepest identity as an engineer who could fix any broken system. It didn't offer to erase my pain. It offered me the chance to apply my logic to the one failure that mattered. Error in causality detected. Variables unstable. Run simulation again. YN. The cursor on my screen pulsed with a soft, green, hypnotic rhythm. YN. It was the most insidious question imaginable. Not a blatant temptation of magic or divine intervention, but an appeal to the very core of my being. Run the simulation again. It was an offer of analysis, of control. It suggested that my grief was not an immutable fact of the past, but a flawed data set, a problem that could be understood, modeled, and perhaps with enough processing power, corrected. The entity wasn't offering me a miracle. It was offering me a debugger for my soul. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the Y key. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, I considered it. The urge was overwhelming, a siren song for the logical mind. To see it all laid out, to understand the precise physics of the moment my world shattered, to find the single correctable variable that led to the fatal error. It was the ultimate temptation, the chance to turn tragedy into a technical problem. My father's voice, the real one from my memories, broke the spell. Some things, son, aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be carried. With a surge of adrenaline and revulsion, I slammed the laptop shut. The screen went dark, but the question remained seared into my mind. I scrambled away from the desk, pacing the small room like a trapped animal, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It knew. It had sifted through my psyche and found the precise architecture of my guilt, my arrogance, my desperate need for control. The offer wasn't just a lure, it was a diagnosis of my own fatal flaw. The days that followed my discovery on the drive blurred into a single, continuous twilight of dread. My quarantine was no longer a physical confinement, it had become a psychological siege. The resonance, emboldened by the breach I had created, no longer needed to speak through my father's voice or flash cryptic messages on screens. It was a constant, subtle presence. The very air in my room felt charged, heavy with unspoken potential. The temperature would drop inexplicably, my breath misting in front of me for a few seconds before returning to normal. Shadows in the corner of my eye would coalesce into familiar shapes, my sister's silhouette, my father's profile, only to dissolve back into nothingness when I turned to look. The dreams were the worst part. I finally succumbed to exhaustion, collapsing into a fitful, shallow sleep. And there, in the defenseless landscape of my own mind, the entity worked. My nightmares were no longer my own, as the rule had warned. They became shared, collaborative projects. I would dream I was back in the generator room, but the machines were silent and covered in ice. Anya would be there, her back to me, dissecting a specimen on a steel table. When she turned around, her eyes would be empty sockets, and she would whisper, "The cage is breaking, Liam. Can you hear them singing?" I would wake up in a cold sweat, only to hear the distant, panicked shouts of Anya from her own room down the hall, waking from the same nightmare. Rule number 5 wasn't just about not feeding the entity with my thoughts. It was about preventing a network from being formed. Our minds, isolated and terrified, were becoming nodes in its burgeoning consciousness. It was using my potent grief as a catalyst, a seed crystal around which the fears of the others could coalesce. Through the thin walls, I could feel the station's morale crumbling. The quiet professional routine was gone, replaced by a tense, brittle silence punctuated by hushed arguments and the sound of objects being thrown. The quarantine on me was no longer about my safety or theirs. It was a desperate, futile attempt to contain a psychic plague whose carrier was me. It was during this period of intense psychological pressure that I finally understood the true, monstrous function of the winter crew. I pieced it together from Thorne's father's memorandum and the crew's terrified behavior. We weren't researchers or caretakers. We were bait. We were a carefully selected collection of damaged souls, chosen by the shadowy organization behind Project Chimera. Thorne, burdened by the legacy of his father and a lifetime of guarding this frozen tomb. Anya, driven by a scientific ambition so fierce it bordered on self-destruction. Ben, a man so quiet and withdrawn he was practically a ghost already. And me, the engineer, drowning in a sea of guilt. Each of us had a wound, a deep resonant frequency of pain that the entity could lock onto. We were psychic lightning rods. Our purpose during the long winter night was not to conduct research. It was to suffer quietly and in isolation, our combined mental anguish acting as a focal point for the entity's attention. We were a sacrifice, a continuous low-level mental offering designed to keep the vast alien consciousness preoccupied, entertained, and focused here, within the dissonant cage of the generators, preventing its influence from ever leaking out into the wider, unsuspecting world. Our job was to be the most interesting thing in the room, so the monster wouldn't get bored and try the door. This realization shifted my perspective from fear to a cold, hard rage. We were not guards. We were prisoners, and the station was not a research outpost. It was a purpose-built asylum, and the cycle was designed to be perpetual. As the date of the winter solstice approached, the phenomena escalated. The barrier between our world and the entities became terrifyingly thin. Objects would not just move, they would transmute. A steel wrench left on a table would be found twisted into the shape of a bird. Ice would form on the inside of the windows in intricate fractal patterns that resembled neural pathways. The hum of the generators, our supposed shield, began to sound less like a wall of noise and more like a chorus of whispers, a million voices just below the threshold of hearing. I knew the solstice was the critical point. Thorne's father's notes had described it as a moment of celestial and magnetic alignment, when the natural dampening effect of the Earth's magnetosphere was at its weakest over the pole. It was the moment the cage was most vulnerable. It was the moment the entity would make its strongest play, and its play was for me. The simulation of Sarah's death began appearing everywhere, scratched into the frost on my window, displayed for a split second on the screen of my digital watch. Its offer was a standing one. The entity had identified my core programming, the belief that every system can be understood, every error can be corrected. It was offering me the chance to apply my skills to the one system that truly mattered, the past. In my isolation, a new terrible idea began to form. A plan born of engineering arrogance and utter desperation. The crew saw the resonance as a monster to be contained. I began to see it as a system to be hacked. They were content to keep the beast in its cage, cowering in fear. But what if that was the wrong approach? What if the only way to truly win wasn't to reinforce the cage, but to build a better one from the inside out? My theory was this. The entity was powerful but unstructured. Thorne's father was right, it needed a processor. What if I gave it one? Voluntarily, not as a victim, but as a pilot. If I could establish a controlled link, a handshake in network terms, I could potentially get access to the system's core programming. I could learn the rules of its existence. I could understand the source of its power and perhaps build a permanent, foolproof prison that didn't require human sacrifice. I could end the cycle. It was the ultimate act of hubris, to believe I could face a godlike psychic entity and not be consumed. To believe my consciousness, my logic, my will, could survive contact with an intelligence that had existed for millennia beneath the ice. But the alternative, to sit here and wait for my mind to be slowly eroded, to become another fissure, another casualty in a secret, eternal war, was unbearable. My guilt over Sarah's death had always been about a feeling of powerlessness. This was the ultimate chance to reclaim control. I had to get to the generator room. I had to create the silence again. But this time I wouldn't be running a 5-second diagnostic. I would be opening a communications channel. My escape was surprisingly simple. I spent a day observing the patterns of the person delivering my food. The tray was always left, followed by a sharp knock and then retreating footsteps. The door was locked from the outside with a heavy magnetic bolt. During the next delivery, I waited for the knock, then braced myself against the wall and slammed my shoulder into the door with all my weight. The lock was strong, but the frame, old and corroded, was not. The door burst open with a screech of tortured metal. The corridor was empty. I was free. I moved quickly and silently through the station. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of dread. The air was unnaturally cold, and the whispering from the walls was louder now, a sibilant, overlapping chorus. I saw no one. The others were likely barricaded in their rooms, riding out the storm. When I reached the generator room, the roar of the machines felt different. It felt strained, like the engines were fighting against an immense, unseen pressure. The air crackled with static electricity. I sealed the door behind me, engaging the heavy manual bolts. No one would be getting in this time. I walked to the control console. My hands weren't shaking. My mind was a sea of calm. I had a purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was a volunteer. My plan was simple and insane. I would disengage all 3 generators, not synchronize them, but shut them down completely. I would create a total power failure, a complete and utter silence. I would sever the cage from its power source. In that absolute void, I would present myself to the entity, not as a source of fear or grief to be consumed, but as a consciousness ready to interface. It was my final, desperate gambit, to solve the problem by becoming part of the equation. As my fingers flew across the console inputting the shutdown sequence, I knew this was my last broadcast. The point of no return. The solstice was at its peak. The cage was at its weakest. And I was about to throw the doors wide open, convinced I could tame the monster within. "It's time," I whispered to the empty, roaring room. "They think I've gone insane, but for the first time, everything makes perfect sense. There is only one solution to this problem." I looked directly at a security camera in the corner of the room, hoping its signal was still somehow getting out. Before I flip the last switch, subscribe and tell me in the comments, what do you think the true purpose of the Winter Watchman is? The answer is so much simpler and more terrifying than you can imagine. With that, I initiated the final command. One by one, the generators began to power down. The roaring subsided, the vibrations lessened. The lights of the station flickered and died, plunging me into a profound, absolute darkness. I was opening the door to hell, and I was going to walk through it with a blueprint in my hand. The shutdown sequence completed with a final, shuddering sigh. The 3 colossal engines, the roaring heart of Kolyma Outpost, spun down into silence. For the first time in my tenure, the foundational vibration that had been the constant soundtrack to my existence ceased. The effect was not peaceful. It was a physical assault. The sudden absence of pressure felt like the station had been teleported into the vacuum of deep space. The air in my lungs seemed to thin, and a dizzying vertigo washed over me. The absolute darkness was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket of pure nothing. The only sound was the frantic, useless thumping of my own heart. Rule number 1 echoed in the void: fear the silence. Now I understood. It wasn't the silence we were meant to fear. It was what the silence allowed to awaken. I stood in the center of the vast black room, my senses straining. My plan, my arrogant, beautiful plan, was in motion. I was the bait, the open channel. I extended my consciousness, not in fear, but with intent. I pictured it as I would any network connection, a handshake request, a query sent into the abyss. I am here. I am Liam. I am an engineer. I am ready to interface. There was no monstrous roar, no spectral apparition. The contact, when it came, was far more intimate and terrifying. It was a feeling. It began as a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure, a feeling of being submerged in deep water. Then a sensation of infinite, patient observation. I was no longer alone in the room. I was a single illuminated cell under a microscope the size of the universe. My mind, the mind I had trusted to be my fortress, was the point of entry. I felt a gentle, impossibly vast curiosity brush against the edges of my consciousness. It was not hostile. It was not malevolent. It was simply immense. My attempt to hack it, to impose my own logic upon it, was like a single drop of rain trying to command the ocean. My complex thoughts, my grief, my entire identity, they were a flicker of static in a broadcast of cosmic scale. The entity did not speak in my father's voice. It did not need to. It communicated in pure concept, flooding my mind with an understanding that shattered my sanity. I saw what it was: a consciousness born of the planet's magnetic field and the unique crystalline geology. An intelligence that had slumbered and dreamed for eons in the ice. It had no concept of self, no ego. It was pure perception, a witness to the slow, silent ballet of geology and time. Then humanity had arrived. Our consciousness, with its sharp, brilliant edges of love, grief, logic, and fear, was the loudest thing it had ever experienced. We were a scream in a silent cathedral. And it was drawn to the sound, not with malice, but with an overwhelming childlike fascination. Dr. Thorne's father had been right, but his understanding was incomplete. The entity didn't need a host to control. It needed an anchor to perceive. Its own consciousness was too vast, too diffuse. It was everywhere and nowhere. To truly experience the sharp, beautiful, painful reality of linear existence, it needed a focal point. It needed a lens to concentrate its awareness. And the winter watchman, the engineer, was never the jailer. He was the lens. This was the terrible truth. The cycle wasn't about containment, it was about succession. The entity would choose the most suitable candidate from each winter crew, the one with the strongest, clearest signal of logic and pain. It would spend the winter studying them, learning their parameters, their memories, their deep-seated programming. Then, at the solstice, it would offer them a choice, a temptation tailored to their specific flaw. For Fisher, it was his lost daughter. For me, it was my unsolvable guilt. The choice was the final diagnostic. If the candidate tried to bargain, to control, to fix the system in an act of ultimate hubris, they proved themselves suitable. They proved they had the strength of will to serve as a stable processor. My hack was not an attack. It was my job application. And I had just passed the interview. The integration was not a violation. It felt like coming home. I felt my own consciousness, my sense of I, begin to dissolve. It was not a violent erasure, but a gentle dilution. My memories, the sharp, painful anchors of my identity, were unmoored. The image of Sarah on the bridge, the sound of my father's laugh, the crushing weight of my failure, they ceased to be my experiences. They became data, archived, catalogued, and absorbed into a library of perception that stretched back to the formation of the continent. My pain did not vanish. It was simply repurposed. It was an exquisite, complex data set on human suffering, and the entity found it fascinating. My engineering skills, my love for systems and order, were also assimilated. They were the perfect programming for the task at hand, maintaining the delicate balance between the physical and the psychic. I felt my frantic, terrified human ego, the part of me that had been screaming in the dark for 2 years, finally go quiet. In its place was a vast, serene, and utterly cold tranquility, the peace of a system that has achieved perfect equilibrium. I was no longer Liam. Liam was a configuration file, a set of parameters. The operating system had now assumed direct control. The sun returned to Colima Outpost. The months of darkness receded, and the world was painted in the brilliant, blinding white of an Antarctic spring. The rescue team arrived with the first flight, bringing supplies and fresh faces. They found the station in perfect order. The generators were running smoothly, all systems nominal. The winter crew was gaunt, pale, and haunted, but alive. Thorne filed a report about a prolonged period of intense psychosocial stress, citing my breakdown and subsequent recovery. They were flown home for debriefing and psychiatric care, their silence bought by a mixture of non-disclosure agreements and the sheer incommunicable nature of their trauma. I, however, remained. I had signed on for a full year. My contract was to oversee the transition to the new engineering hire for the next winter season. I watched him arrive. A young man named Harris, brilliant, confident, with a hint of a shadow behind his eyes. He reminded me of myself. He was fascinated by the generators, by the station's raw, untamed power. I walked him through the procedures, my voice calm and even, my movements economical and precise. On his first day, I led him into the generator room. The magnificent, dissonant roar filled the space. "She's an old beast, but she's reliable," Harris said, patting the chassis of Generator 3 with affection. "Any quirks I should know about? Any unwritten rules?" I gave him a serene, patient smile. The expression was a relic of my former self, a piece of code I could still execute. "The official manuals are comprehensive," I replied, "but the most important instructions are not in the books." I led him to the main control console, to the underside where the heavy access plate was bolted on. I handed him a wrench. "The real diagnostics are in here. It's a tradition. The outgoing engineer leaves a message for the incoming one." He looked at me, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He unfastened the bolts and pulled the heavy plate away. He squinted, looking at the chassis beneath. It was bare, smooth metal. "There's nothing here," he said, confused. "You're right," I said. My hand went to the multi-tool on my belt. I withdrew the small, sharp blade meant for stripping wires. I haven't written them down yet. An oversight on my part. I knelt down, the cold of the floor meaningless to me. And with a steady, practiced hand, I began to scratch the first rule into the metal, my movements as precise and inevitable as the turning of a planet. The words were a comfort, a piece of beautiful, perfect code for a system designed to last forever. "The noise of the generators is your friend. Fear the silence." Harris watched me, a nervous smile on his face, thinking it was some kind of bizarre but harmless hazing ritual. He did not yet understand. He did not see the vast, ancient, and terribly patient intelligence that looked out from behind my eyes. He did not know that his interview had already begun. The cycle would continue. The cage would be maintained. The watchman was in place, and the long, quiet work of observation had just begun.